Roy. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and I want to welcome all of you to our program today, which is looking at a very interesting topic, which is how the North Koreans look at China. This program is a project of the North Korea International Documentation Project, but it's jointly sponsored by the United States Institute of Peace and the Kissinger Institute. We're very fortunate to have Richard Solomon from the United States Institute of Peace here to join us for part of the program this afternoon. It's hardly surprising that relations between China and North Korea both involve elements of cooperation and elements of sensitivity, tension. I can remember coming back from Moscow in 1973 and visiting Canada a couple of years later, and the briefing we received at the American Embassy in Ottawa made it sound as though our relations with Canada were worse than they were with the Soviet Union at the time. We had an enormous number of problems with Canada, and yet most Americans think our relations with Canada are a model of how you should get along with other countries. Again, it's just an illustration of the fact that when you have common borders, common problems, different historical traditions, different ethnic backgrounds, it's easy to run into a host of problems. I am more familiar with looking at how the Chinese look at North Korea, and today we're going to be looking at the other direction based on documents that are part of the work of the North Korea International Documentation Project. Dick Solomon, could I ask you to say a word or two, and then we'll launch right into our program.
Thanks very much, Stape. I'm delighted to sprinkle a little holy water here on behalf of the Institute of Peace and my colleague John Park, who leads our work on East Asia, and to say how much the Institute benefits by its collaboration with numbers of institutions around town, but particularly the Wilson Center. As you probably know, the head of the Wilson Center, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, was a major leader of our Iraq Study Group effort, and in many other ways we collaborate with this institution. Let me make the obvious that today's conference is extremely well-timed. And if anybody has any doubts about our intelligence about what's going on in North Korea, it's obvious that when this conference was scheduled, how many months ago, Stape or John? It was clearly before the world knew that there was going to be a missile launch, but somehow the Institute and the Wilson Center knew something big was coming. So here we are at a day when the world is focused on the challenges of dealing with North Korea. As many of you may know, there is a series of books that the Institute has published comparing the way that different governments manage negotiating. And one of the first volumes in that series was done by Scott Snyder, entitled Negotiating on the Edge of Insanity, or the Edge of Tension, or however you might want to characterize it. Scott Snyder, back in the early to mid, I guess it was the mid-1990s, tried to come up with a sense of how the North Koreans managed negotiating. And he went around the world talking to diplomats from every country except the United States, which really had had almost no direct interaction with the North Koreans of recent date, trying to piece together their approach to negotiation. And it's very clear that they are an extremely difficult, challenging counterpart for negotiating almost anything, but specifically negotiating on our objective of seeing the peninsula denuclearized. As a result, you'll see, as for example, if you read an op-ed piece in today's Wall Street Journal by John Bolton from the American Enterprise Institute, former ambassador to the United Nations, it isn't even worth the effort. That it's very clear that North Korea has no intention to give up its nuclear program, and that negotiations simply give them time, help them buy time to string out a negotiation as a cover for their continuing efforts to develop their missiles and presumably even their nuclear weapons program. There is, of course, an alternative view to John Bolton's, and that is negotiation with the North is worth the effort despite the frustrations and the unpromising prospect for success. Now, this workshop today, this event, helps us focus on one critical assumption that all American negotiators bring to dealing with the North Korean challenge, and that is that China has significant leverage over the North Koreans. And again, the Bolton piece throws cold water on that. China has really not demonstrated the ability to constrain, convince the North Korean leadership that giving up its nuclear program is in its own interest. There's a fair amount of evidence that the Chinese leadership some years ago made an effort to convince the leadership in Pyongyang that the China approach to modernization, to economic development, was a path that they should follow, the Kaifang, the opening up to the world approach that has been in many ways so successful for China under the Deng Xiaoping policies. But all the evidence that we've gained is that the North Korean military looked at the China example and said, oh, we don't want that. Look, they had Tiananmen. They've incurred what, from a North Korean perspective, were a series of unacceptable foreign influences as a result of the opening up process. So China has, by a number of measures that will be discussed, I'm sure, in great detail today, shown that its influence is significantly limited. But as we try to help the new administration, which does want to try to engage North Korea on the nuclear problem, figure out what are the sources of leverage. Your discussions here today, I think, will be a major contribution to testing this fundamental assumption that China, of all countries, has some leverage, some influence over the North Koreans, and thus should be brought into play as part of a negotiating effort. So again, I think this is a very timely effort, and Stape, thanks again for our collaboration.
Thank you, Dick. We're going to have 3 presentations by the experts at this table, followed with comments by our discussant, Dr. Jin, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. It's a very full program, so I'm going to ask our speakers to try keep an eye on the clock. Stay within your time limits, please, and I'll provide timely reminders if the clock is beginning to press on you. Let's begin. Jim, would you like to lead off?
Thank you, Ambassador Roy, and thank you both to the Kissinger Institute and to USIP for helping us put this timely event together. I can assure you that when John and I first started talking about it, we had no idea that it was going to be so timely. But go ahead and begin. There's growing frustration in Washington with China because of Beijing's reluctance to use leverage over North Korea to get Pyongyang to verifiably abandon its nuclear weapons program and to halt missile tests. As some observers note, had China done more than express concern over the recent missile launch, Pyongyang might have actually thought twice about firing off the Taepodong 2 missile this past weekend. Now, the most often cited explanation for China's lack of action is its fear of instability along this 800-mile border with North Korea and the possible influx of millions of refugees. Now, another possibility is that China is taking a longer-term approach to the Sino-DPRK relationship and simply does not want to irritate the present and future powers that be in Pyongyang to guarantee that Kim Jong-il's successors are well disposed toward China. Now, I should note that Beijing really doesn't need to try too hard to curry favor with Pyongyang these days because, as a result of Seoul and Washington essentially severing relations with, or severing contacts with North Korea, Pyongyang is left with no choice but to become closer to Beijing. Now, I believe, however, that although it can be argued that Beijing does have more leverage over North Korea than any other nation, and that China is North Korea's only ally of note, its leverage over North Korea is still quite limited. Now, the reason for this is that over the past 6 decades, the Sino-DPRK alliance has been far from ideal. In fact, it could best be described as uneasy. Now, the conventional wisdom is that China has been North Korea's staunchest ally ever since hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's volunteers intervened in the Korean War in 1950 to save the DPRK from being wiped off the face of the planet. Now, since that time, the relationship between North Korea and China has been described as being as close as lips and teeth. Many observers speculate that the alliance was first tested in 2006 when North Korea defied China and fired a Taepodong-2 missile and then detonated a nuclear device. Now, since then, much has been written and said about Beijing's frustrations with its supposed irrational and unpredictable ally. North Korea has been a sensitive subject and at times an embarrassment for China in recent years. However, little has been said or written about North Korea's perception of the alliance. Now, as the materials in the briefing book assembled for this panel suggest, the alliance could at best be described as uneasy. North Korea has often viewed China as overly interventionist and at times unreliable. Now, I'd like to briefly examine several important events from the history of Sino-DPRK relations that have put serious strains on this alliance. In most instances, China attempted to influence policy inside North Korea. Now, at times, North Korea had genuine cause for feeling upset about this or betrayed by this, while at other times less so. Nonetheless, because of the events I'm about to describe, China's influence over North Korea has become increasingly limited. I want to start, however, by quickly highlighting an important dynamic in Sino-Korean relations preceding the founding of the PRC and the DPRK. Now, until the late 19th century, Joseon Korea was part of an international system, international relations system in East Asia, where smaller peripheral countries paid tribute to China in exchange for security and for the Middle Kingdom's favor. Now, the Korean term for this tributary relationship was sade, or serving the great. Joseon Korea was the most loyal of all countries that were part of this system, making tributary missions to China every year until 1894. Korean kings were crowned only after receiving the blessings of China. Now, North Korea's founding leader, Kim Il-sung, saw this as a major cause of Korea's weakness, leading the country to fall victim to 35 years of Japan's harsh colonial rule. Now, the DPRK's governing ideology, Juche, is essentially a rejection of this system. Juche started as an anti-hegemonic or anti-foreign slogan or catchphrase and evolved over the course of a decade or so into a genuine ideology of self-reliance. Now, as the North Korean system developed and as Juche evolved, those who advocated, or those in the leadership of North Korea who advocated mechanically importing policies from China or from the Soviet Union, were accused of flunkyism or toadyism, or of being like Joseon Dynasty officials and kowtowing or to the great. Now, throughout the past 6 decades, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean leadership has resisted all attempts by the Soviet Union and China to influence policy in the DPRK. Now, the first major incident in Sino-DPRK relations, at least for the North Koreans, was the Korean War. Now, several scholars, including Yevgeny Bazhanov and Alexei Mansurov, have described Kim Il-sung's frustrations with the Soviet Union, especially once the United States entered the conflict under the flag of the United Nations. Less is known of Kim Il-sung's frustrations with China during the war, at a time when the Sino-DPRK alliance was supposedly being forged with blood. Following the entry of the Chinese People's Volunteers in 1950, the Korean leadership balked over the idea of having in its midst a foreign military apparatus with control over field operations. Now, they also blamed the Chinese People's Volunteers for the failure to drive UN forces off the Korean Peninsula in 1951. Moreover, the relationship between China's high command and the North Korean government were far from smooth. Peng Dehui, who was commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, allegedly had very little respect for Kim Il-sung as a military leader and made no secret of this. Because of the disastrous result of the initial invasion of South Korea, the Chinese in North Korea were far from shy about intriguing against Kim Il-sung. Now, Mao Zedong later apologized to Kim Il-sung for Peng Dehui's big power chauvinism, but the damage had already been done, and these personal animosities continued to affect Sino-DPRK relations into the post-war era. As document number 1 in our reader describes, in 1955, Korean leaders made no effort to maintain contact with the Chinese high command, whose headquarters were just a short distance from Pyongyang. At the same time, Zhou Enlai, apparently disturbed by North Korea's ingratitude, intentionally avoided North Korean officials at diplomatic functions in Beijing. Now, the Chinese People's Volunteers remained in North Korea until 1958, helping in post-war reconstruction by adding to the greatly reduced labor force. However, this too caused tensions in the alliance, as the presence of hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers in Korea and their increasing dependence on for food on local supplies produced friction between them and the Korean people. Perhaps the greatest, or the most blatant example of China infringing on North Korea's sovereignty, however, occurred in September 1956. Following a 3-year debate inside the Korean Workers' Party over development strategies, Kim Il-sung purged a number of policy opponents, all of whom were either Soviet Koreans or who had lived in China throughout the colonial occupation and had become members of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, 4 of the purged critics fled to China and informed Mao Zedong of Kim Il-sung's actions. Mao responded by dispatching Peng Dehui, the former commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers and at that time defense minister, while the Soviet Union dispatched Khrushchev's troubleshooter, Anastas Mikoyan, to investigate. Now, this joint Sino-Soviet party intervention, I should note, marked the highest point in Sino-Soviet cooperation. Things quickly deteriorated shortly thereafter. Now, Peng and Mikoyan directly meddled in the internal party affairs of the North Koreans. They forced Kim Il-sung to release individuals from prison and to allow them to return to China with Peng Dehui. They also forced Kim Il-sung to rehabilitate and to reinstate many of his critics. This incident, in fact, dominated political discourse inside the Korean Workers' Party for nearly 3 years, during which Kim Il-sung took full advantage of the emerging Sino-Soviet split to eliminate the influence of China and the Soviet Union in the Korean Workers' Party through a series of purges. By the early 1960s, North Korea's relations with the Soviet Union had deteriorated, and Pyongyang saw its interests falling more in line with those of Beijing. Now, among the incidents leading to the rift in relations with Moscow was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kim Il-sung saw the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Soviet Union's response or actions in the Cuban Missile Crisis as incontrovertible proof that if push came to shove, North Korea could not rely on the Soviet Union, despite any existing treaty of mutual assistance. The Soviet leaders abandoned the Cubans and caved in to the United States, all for the sake of peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev followed up these actions 2 years later by not condemning the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and America's aggression in Vietnam. Now, during the first few years, of the 1960s, Beijing and Pyongyang were perhaps closer than any point in the history of the alliance. Yet, as described in document number 4 in our reader, by late 1964, North Korea began to take measures to limit the influence of China inside the Korean Workers' Party, fearing that the influence of Beijing was growing at an alarming rate. Indeed, another round of purges, in fact, 2 rounds of purges ensued in the mid-1960s. And the first of these was initiated to limit China's influence in the party. By 1966, there was a major shift in the Sino-DPRK alliance, and the alliance had all but ceased to exist. The rift in the relationship began with China's Cultural Revolution, when Red Guards labeled Kim Il-sung a fat revisionist. They also strapped dead ethnic Koreans to trains that were being sent across the border at Sinwiju, and scrawled little notes on the sides of these trains, like, "You will be next, you little revisionist." They also cut shipments of goods and resources to North Korea, despite pre-existing economic agreements. Now, at the height of tensions, there were even armed clashes along the border near Paektusan, or Whitehead Mountain. Now, during the Cultural Revolution, China again attempted to manipulate the inner workings of the DPRK. They did this by encouraging the North Korean people to overthrow their leaders and to launch a cultural revolution of their own. They did this by broadcasting messages across the border and by posting display cases in front of in front of the PRC's embassy in Pyongyang. Now, to restrict these actions, the North Korean leadership took a number of measures, including passing a law that would ban display cases in front of all embassies. The Chinese embassy refused to take down their display. It explained that they would abide by the North Korean laws that they liked and disregard all others. Now, to prevent people from seeing these displays, the North Koreans simply blocked off foot traffic. They actually blocked all foot traffic in front of the Chinese embassy. Now, during this time, the Red Guards also reported in newspapers that Kim Il-sung had actually been overthrown by pro-Chinese forces in a coup d'etat. This is also in the document reader. In fact, many of the documents in the reader are from this period and describe in rich detail the actions of China, as well as Kim Il-sung's own countermeasures in the DPRK. Now, by 1970, relations began to thaw just a bit, especially following Zhou Enlai's trip to Pyongyang in 1970, where the premier apologized for China's past misdeeds. Now, official propaganda aside, the alliance never fully recovered. In conversations with other communist leaders in later decades, including in the 1984 conversation with Honecker, that is in the document reader, Kim Il-sung regularly referred to the actions of China during the Cultural Revolution. Now, through though China was less interventionist in the 1970s than in previous decades, China's actions nonetheless continued to disappoint the North Korean leadership. First was the Sino-US Rapprochement. This soured relations with North Korea. A few years later, inspired by Vietnam's success at reunification, Kim Il-sung traveled to Beijing in 1975, where he asked for China's assistance in liberating South Korea. His request was denied. Kim Il-sung saw this as proof of China's accommodation to the United States, and was so upset by this that he began to make overtures to the Soviet Union, despite China's well-known, still in the midst of the Sino-Soviet split. From 1978, China began to focus more on its own national development and began to adopt a number of market reforms. This, too, angered the North Korean leadership, who continued to adhere to the same autarkic economic model that it had been using since 1953. Then, finally, in 1980, when Kim Jong-il was anointed Kim Il-sung's successor at the Sixth Party Congress, Beijing objected, publishing scathing criticisms of hereditary succession in party newspapers. Now, perhaps the greatest betrayal in the eyes of North Korea, however, was China's recognition of South Korea in 1992. And China, in fact, made very little effort to prepare North Korea for this. Now, I'll let John Park bring us up to, a bit later, bring us up to more recent troubles in Sino-DPRK relations. I want to conclude, though, by noting that although China might have been overly interventionist and at times an unreliable ally in the eyes of the North Koreans, it has not been a useless ally. China has served as an important conduit for communication between major regional powers and North Korea. China has also served as a political and diplomatic protector of North Korea, and of course as a source of economic support. There are a couple lessons that we can take away from this, however. First, it's clear that because of this uneasy relationship, China's leverage is not as strong as many in Washington would like to think. It is not has not been as close as lips and teeth. Moreover, North Korea is not altogether comfortable with the idea of having China apply leverage, which it sees as an infringement on its sovereignty. Finally, I just want to note that for the U.S., it's important that we understand that both China and North Korea recognize that that once South Korea and the United States severed relation or severed any communication with North Korea, North Korea had no one to turn to but China. And both are aware of this, and the Chinese are now trying to cultivate this relationship, trying to improve their image in the eyes of the North Koreans. They're holding weekly dinners at the embassy, weekly events in an attempt to create human networks in North Korea, to create loyalties among the future leadership in North Korea. I think this is something that the United States and South Korea are unfortunately in no position to do presently, which is unfortunate. I believe we should understand now that we should actually recognize that with China not having as much leverage as we thought, as we believed, we should look at this as an opportunity to go in and try to establish relations with the North Korean or the powers that be in Pyongyang. And that'll. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Steve?
Yes.
Could I make a comment or two when?
If you were brief, you are welcome to make a comment or two.
Just first a factoid and then a perspective that I hope you'll pursue. First, I'm not sure it's ever been formally confirmed, but when Henry Kissinger made his secret trip to Beijing in July of 1971, the rumor is that Kim Il-sung was in Beijing because neither one or the other knew the other that is in town. And right after Kissinger left Beijing, Zhou Enlai went over to Pyongyang to try to explain what had happened. I think the meaning of it is that, as was suggested, China didn't want to totally antagonize the North Koreans and did try to maintain a working relationship. But the broader strategic issue is a very interesting one, and it was implicit in what your comments were a moment ago about Sino-Soviet relations. The North Korean leadership has sought to survive in this strategically very critical but difficult environment by having multiple great power relations so that they could play one major power off against another, and they seem to have done that to some degree during the period of Sino-Soviet rivalry. During my one negotiating experience with the North Korean delegation in New York back in 1992, the North Korean official made it clear he wanted a good relationship with the United States because it gave the opportunity to protect North Korea against what he said was their major threat, Japan. While the Japanese, we know, have a very difficult history in dealing with the Koreans, both North and South, the North Korean official was, I'm sure, referring as much to their challenging relationship with the Chinese. A few years ago, when South Korea seemed to be putting a lot of eggs in its foreign affairs basket with China, having developed very strong economic relations, I chided the South Korean foreign minister about how close they seemed to be moving to China. And he said, oh, no, we have to maintain strong relations with the United States because we know the history of China's influence on the Korean Peninsula, and we don't want to be dependent on China alone, which raises a very interesting dilemma for the North Koreans and in many ways for us right now, and that is, I think the logic of North Korea wanting to be able to play one major power off against another should lead, as the North Korean official suggested to me a few years ago, to have good relations with us. But of course, they don't seem prepared to pay the price that we would expect, either on the denuclearization issue or something like human rights matters, as the price for having normal relations with the United States. But this issue of the dynamic in North Korea's strategic policy of trying to have multiple great power relations as protection is, again, something worth exploring.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Solomon. We now have Dr. Schaefer, who will address flashpoints in the uneven relationship.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming to this event. Thank you very much, the USIP and the North Korean International Documentation Project to organize it, and thank you for having me here. I will follow up on some of the issues James Person has touched upon, and then maybe trying to have a sort of bridge to the remarks by John Park, and give another sort of overview with some pointed opinions and interpretations on the trajectory of North Korean Sino relations between the 60s and the 80s and the present. The 60s I would define as from subservience to defiance. James has mentioned that China was extremely obtrusive and had high expectations in North Korean gratitude, in absolute following to Chinese advice. And North Korea broke free of this Chinese embrace by 1964 because Khrushchev's overthrow in the Soviet Union gave North Korea the chance to move towards a somewhat more neutral position within this emerging Sino-Soviet conflict. Also, it was still much more on the Chinese side. It really shifted a little bit from that. It did not join in all those anti-Soviet polemics anymore to that extent. But another real major extent and really, I would say, outstanding act of North Korean defiance, highly risky to Kim Il-sung and the entire North Korean state, was to resist the explicit Chinese request to have a cultural revolution in North Korea. The Cultural Revolution, this is often overlooked, was not just an internal Chinese event. China expected from its very close allies to have the same kind of revolution and convulsion in their own countries. And the countries from which it expected its most were its closest allies at the time, which were Albania in Europe, but then North Korea and North Vietnam in Asia. And both Ho Chi Minh and both Kim Il-sung personally told Mao they're not going to do that for various reasons, because they have capitalist South in Vietnam and in Korea, and they want to liberate this South by revolution, but they cannot alienate the bourgeois forces they need in order to have allies in the South, and they're not going to go against the cultural heritage of their own nation. And this was really a defiant act which brought North Korea really in very hot water. And between 1966 and 1969, I would say Kim Il-sung barely survived, but they really finally managed that. And then this Chinese interference, James gave some examples, into really explicit regime change in Pyongyang by having a pro-Chinese leader at the helm who would emulate the Cultural Revolution. After this didn't work out, China really backed down after the Sino-Soviet border clashes in 1969. China changed course in its foreign policy to some extent. It looked for allies and it looked for North Korea, and China basically backed down and apologized, which led to great relief in North Korea, but although gave North Korea quite some leverage in its dealings with China, because China really came in this conflict, so to speak, between China and North Korea. China came across as the weaker part, and North Korea finally triumphed. During the 1970s, still, North Korea more or less stayed at Chinese heels for the very reason, because it expected China to be of great support in achieving Korean reunification on socialist terms, and maybe Korean unification before Vietnamese reunification. This is also a major topic through the entire 60s and 70s, and I think also very important also for Korean domestic policies, that Vietnam, the example of Vietnam, where a successful socialist revolution will lead to the reunification of the countries, where the Vietnamese are really fighting the Americans, whereas the North Koreans are not really having to fight the Americans. That during this period, it was a constant challenge to Kim Il-sung not to be outdone by Vietnam. And he saw the great opportunity with the Sino-US opening in 1971 and the ensuing rapprochement to have a sort of negotiated solution to the Korean problem by getting the Americans out of the peninsula. I think we have no indication that they were aware of the first secret Kissinger visit in July 71, but they came out strongly in favor as the only socialist country besides Romania of the Sino-US Rapprochement, which of course China was quite grateful for. But during the second Kissinger visit, and definitely during the Nixon-Kissinger visit in 72, during the summit with Mao, North Korea had a high-ranking delegation on-site in Beijing, and they were hoping that some way there might be a bilateral encounter with the Americans to negotiate directly with the Americans. They expected from the Chinese to negotiate on North Korea's behalf, basically to get the Americans out. And apparently they got the impressions from the Chinese that China is doing this opening to the US primarily for the purpose of getting Taiwan back to the Chinese state, and getting the Americans out of East Asia to a major extent. And North Korea hoped if it would follow Chinese policy at this point, they would maybe have a reunification. And in 72, they changed, they definitely changed the dynamics in Korea. You had this brief period of bilateral talks between North and South Korea, the joint declaration for the unification of the fatherland on 4th of July in 1972, and North Korea still hoped that it could somehow achieve a sort of, let's say, regime change in Seoul, or a pro-Northern regime in Seoul, which would basically ask the Americans officially to leave, and that way having a reunification without having really to fight the Americans by getting them out on the negotiating process. But China also got quite some military leverage over North Korea and the entire process, and I think this really, has to be mentioned to China's credit, that definitely in 1975 and maybe even in 1976, after those so-called X murders at the DMZ, China really used its influence to restrain North Korea to have any military action started against South Korea or against U.S. forces in the south, and they were close doing so. 75, because of the Vietnamese example, this was mentioned, this was basically a major challenge to Kim Il-sung, that Vietnam and Cambodia, at the same time Kampuchea, achieved something which North Korea apparently wasn't able to do so. And he really went to Beijing in April 75 and hoped for a green light by Beijing to have a military action in the south of Korea. During the entire 70s, there was a sort of alliance in what the North Koreans called anti-dominationism or anti-hegemonism, as the Chinese called it. There was a sort of real alliance between North Korea and China in various parts of Africa and Asia. There are numerous examples for that. Most of them are pretty much unknown. Kampuchea, the Pol Pot regime, is one of the major examples where North Korea and China did their utmost to prop them up against Vietnam. And apparently the North Koreans helped them to get all the gold out of the country before the Vietnamese arrived in Phnom Penh. Or they were very active in Africa in various countries together with the Chinese to fight the Soviets and the Cubans in Angola and Zaire and all kinds of other places. And one example I just mentioned, that one of the major symbols of modernization for North Korea, the underground rail system, the underground transportation, the metro in Pyongyang, was built by the Chinese in a very visible way with Chinese specialists and Chinese technology, and served as one of the examples in the 70s of Sino-North Korean cooperation. During the 80s, I headlined them from diversification to contraction. North Korea was keeping distant from China in some ways because China started reforms, capitalist reforms, as the North Koreans viewed them, and North Korea became quite uneasy about what to make of the reforms by Deng Xiaoping in China. And at the same time, the Sino-Soviet split seemed to disappear with a sort of the Sino-Soviet Rapprochement in 1982 and then the following years. And then during Gorbachev, it really came across the Sino-Soviet rapprochement. The Sino-Soviet split, and I would really agree to what has been said before, was of major benefit to North Korea. It had a lot of very practical distractions, a lot of extremely practical problems with both the Soviets and the Chinese pressuring them in various ways, but it helped them enormously. It helped them enormously, I think, to get away with something they would not have gotten away if China and the Soviet Union would have been in the same boat, namely in having the succession of Kim Jong-il basically established and implemented. When it was finally announced in 1980, then China denounced it. But actually the entire process started in the late 60s, and I think it was basically formalized, and all the observers in Pyongyang knew it. By 72, 73, it was absolutely clear Kim Jong-il is prepared to be the successor to Kim Il-sung, and this was a heresy for any socialist ideology, for Marxism, Leninism. This was really the utmost, to have his own, basically feudalism, to have his own son anointed as a successor against all the parties. And they got away, I think, because at that time the Sino-Soviet split was at its height, and any attempt by either the Chinese or the Soviets to criticize Kim Il-sung heavily for the succession issue might have pushed him in the other direction, so they had utmost restraint, and this really allowed them to get away with this socialist heresy. Now, the Sino-Soviet reforms in the 80s, first by the Chinese and then by Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, resembled a major threat to to North Korea because it raised questions why North Korea would not following those reforms in similar ways. This led to a closer relationship in the late 80s with some temporary European allies, very close relationships for a few years between 86 and 89, especially with East Germany and Romania, who were really the hardcore opponents of Gorbachev in Europe and were also skeptical about the reforms. Now, the lessons of 1989-91, the breakdown of communism in Eastern Europe, and the downfall of the Soviet Union was, of course, regarded in North Korea first as a sort of shock, but then also seen as a major vindication that the North Korean path was absolutely right, because North Korea did not encounter those problems. It did not break down. And unlike the Chinese, in 89, they did not have a major attempt at any counter-revolution. So North Korea was really able to maintain the domestic security, and it was able to maintain a system, and it really showed that all those reforms just... I want to close with very few remarks before we go to John Park about the 1990s and beyond, what I call mutual dependence and unevenness. And I open it with a quote by Kim Il-sung, which he made, it's also in our document reader here, which he made in a conversation with Erich Honecker, the East German leader, in May 1984. Quote, because of our position, a North Korean position, the length of our border with China, confrontation with the US and Japan, what we are most afraid of is that China will not stick with socialism. And I think this still really holds true until today. Socialism defined as one party firmly in power with an authoritarian system. And I think what I see as a sort of mutual interest between both China and North Korea to have a stability of their respective political systems, that they are basically seeing themselves in a sort of similar boat, similar boat in domestic terms, and nobody wants to rock this boat because the regime change from the system in Beijing to a more democratic system, or a change in North Korea from the authoritarian system to a more democratic system would really jeopardize the interest of the neighbor, because they have a long border, you have a lot of Koreans in China, and you have, of course, all this Chinese influence in North Korea, and this would have a major impact and really rock the boat if in one of those countries the socialist party system would actually fail. Yeah, and then, of course, we can talk about China being now the only economic lifeline left to North Korea, which gives them some leverages. But on the other hand, there are major diverging interests which really make this leverage of China pretty limited. China is really interested in a reduction of tensions. North Korea is much more cavalier about the reduction of tensions. China is really interested in economic development of the entire country. In North Korea, this is a limited interest. As Kim Il-sung said in 84, the richer the people get, the less they become focused on the revolution and other things. It actually spoils people if they are living too well. So I think this is certainly something which you find still as an attitude in North Korea. North Korean leadership, China, I think, is a bit different in this respect. And then China, of course, and this is my last remark, China really fully embraces globalization, at least in economic terms, and still thinks it can survive politically stable with economic globalization, and this is something which North Korea absolutely does not share. Thank you very much. And now, John.
Okay, we'll now ask John Park to address the question of how Pyongyang does what it can and Beijing suffers what it must.
I thought I would add some drama here and bring a quote all the way from the Peloponnesian Wars. Let me first off state that these views are my own. The U.S. Institute of Peace is a strictly independent organization that doesn't espouse any particular viewpoint or policy, so that this disclaimer will allow me to speak freely here. The talk today will be divided into three parts. The first, I wanted to bring to a contemporary sense what was laid down by James and Barron in terms of the first part here, which is giving a recent accounting of instances where the DPRK applied directly or indirectly pressure on China. The second part wanted to look how, compared to the 1990s and the first North Korean nuclear crisis, or some would argue the first phase of an ongoing North Korean nuclear crisis, and now China's behavior has changed dramatically in the sense that now China's diplomacy is much more proactive and it's very multilateral in a direction. And then the third part, again, to be very dramatic, I wanted to talk about the myth of China's leverage over the DPRK. And that's not to say that China doesn't have the political and military capabilities to exert pressure on North Korea to the extent that North Korea would perhaps yield the nuclear arsenal, but to say that there are important political considerations and constraints which inhibit China from using this leverage. So the first part, to look at recent events. There are many to choose from, but I wanted to isolate three. And the first occurred in July of 2006. As you recall, that was the first testing of the Taepodong-2 rocket. And at that time, in the prelude to the testing, China was very adamant in mentioning to the United States and other countries that the situation was under control, that China would use its influence, its both persuasion and other means to basically talk North Korea out from doing the missile test. With the analysis of North Korea, there's always a difficulty with coincidence and correlation. But as the Chinese public statements escalated, it appeared that North Korea was moving ever more confidently and adamantly towards launching their Taepodong-2 rocket, which they did on July 4th of 2006. Now, this period led to an interval where there was early indications that North Korea was preparing a nuclear test. And as we saw the lead up to the nuclear test, again, we saw this cycle of China conveying a sense of confidence to other countries that the situation was somehow under control. Despite stern warnings from Beijing, we saw North Korea do something that caught a lot of people by surprise, at least on the outside, in terms of conducting its nuclear test. In October of 2006, North Korea did something which was unprecedented in the sense that the international community was unified in its reaction and condemnation of the effort. And in fact, at that particular point in time, contrasting the situation now in the UN Security Council, China was the one who led the effort to get the Security Council Resolution 1718 passed. So in addition to condemnation against the nuclear test, there was a reaffirmation of UN Security Council Resolution 1695 from the missile test in July 2006. And with 1718 also came economic sanctions on bans of luxury goods to North Korea. With the recent event, fast forwarding to what happened on Saturday, we see an instance where China is applying pressure indirectly on China in the sense of putting China in a difficult position of having to protect, in a way, the six-party talks. If you listen to the arguments that China is putting forward, it's one of restraint, counseling the United States not to overreact, that the eye on the prize, the main objective here is to restart phase 2 activities and go quickly to verification activities, the protocol, which was essentially something that stopped at the end, towards the end of the Bush administration. If you could make one argument here, it appears that China is developing, in a very direct sense, an understanding of what a stakeholder is all about. A stakeholder vis-a-vis the six-party talks, as chair of the six-party talks, China has become the primary stakeholder. And the way that it protects the six-party talks encourages the members to not overreact, to engage in patience and negotiations, I think demonstrates a very different type of message coming out of Beijing. As Bernd left us in the early 1990s, wanted to continue with that in the second part here and look very briefly at the 1994 North Korean nuclear crisis. Now, this is a snapshot of the crisis then when it involved two countries, the United States and North Korea, and one issue, nuclear proliferation. And in this slide, the dark circle, the darker the circle, the more of a priority this particular issue is for that country. We see here something that may seem a very simplistic slide, but as you'll recall, the 1994 North Korean nuclear crisis, an activity almost of Herculean lengths in terms of diplomatic activities at that particular point in time. We almost had the outbreak of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, many events that are somewhat overshadowed by the recent events, the flurry of activities that currently take place in the six-party talks. But the key takeaway on this slide is that number one, while this slide does look simplistic, recall that this was an enormously difficult crisis to negotiate. And number two, recall China's diplomacy and behavior at that particular point in time. Very concerned in calming down the adversaries and trying to make sure that the situation doesn't escalate to the point of some sort of accidental crisis spilling over into open conflict, but at the same time very discreet. The messages that China conveyed at that particular point in time were largely issued behind closed doors and in very stern terms, but nonetheless a very discreet type of diplomacy. Fast forward to today, and a quick note on this graph. This graph is something that I started, a matrix that I started in August of 2003 when Assistant Secretary of State Jim Kelly was our main representative at the first six-party talks. But at that particular point in time, the slide was somewhat truncated. It was really a three-country type of slide where we had the United States, China, and North Korea. China being the host of what was set up as a bilateral face-saving meeting of the two countries at a particular point in time where tensions were very high. Over time, with the August 2003 beginning of the six-party talks, the first round, we've seen a proliferation of issues being added. I won't go into too much detail about what each of these circles mean, but the key takeaway here is that the circles, as they denote a priority, are relative for that issue vis-a-vis the countries, but also among the issues for that particular country. So the idea here is if you take a relative sense of what's going on, China, as the chair of the six-party talks, is increasingly juggling a lot of balls in the air. And this isn't to say that China doesn't have the political intention or the will to do one thing or another, but I think we're now investigating the limits of political capabilities. China is stretched very thin. If you look, for example, at the deteriorating relationships on the Korean Peninsula, China is smack dab in the middle of trying to maintain good relations with both Pyongyang and Seoul. And also in the middle of maintaining good relations between Pyongyang and Washington. Something has to give, and I don't think this is to say that conspiracy theories abound, but capabilities are such that China right now is perhaps beginning to show the limits of those capabilities management. I don't want to go too much detail about the principles of Chinese foreign policy, but at least wanted to give a quick summary. As China, in dealing and conversing about North Korea, goes back to its primary foreign policy principles, the first is non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. This is front and center when there is any discussion of contingency planning vis-a-vis sudden instability in North Korea. This past fall, with rumors about Kim Jong-il's health, either he was dead or on his deathbed incapacitated, there was a strong interest in engaging China in contingency planning. But China's refrain consistently was that it does not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. And also, in many instances, when different scenarios of potential instability were brought up, Chinese were very practical. For example, some of the scenarios looked at internal instability leading to food issues, food crises. Chinese reaction is to give more food aid. So you can see a big gap in terms of how we see instability and how the Chinese don't see really instability per se, but disaster and then response to disaster. The second part of their principles, they look very closely at cooperation and participation on the multilateral stage. That is something that has become almost a DNA of Chinese interaction on the international stage. As it relates to North Korea, China has tailored these principles to what they call the four sentences. And this is a byproduct of early interviews that I conducted when I was at the Kennedy School doing research on the six-party talks, a phenomenon at that particular point in time that raised a lot of question marks as opposed to answering questions. As it pertains to the four sentences here, the first, the non-proliferation in Asia, second, peaceful settlement through dialogue, third, peace and stability on the peninsula, and fourth, the need to give necessary consideration to North Korea's security considerations and concerns. These are things that have more or less now become the bedrock of the six-party talks. These have infused in terms of what the Chinese are trying to achieve through this multilateral organization. The key question here is what drives China? Why did China tailor their two primary foreign policy principles to come up with a tailored four sentences that become literally the bedrock of their international interaction these days vis-a-vis North Korea? Not to oversimplify, but I would point to a term, Xiaokang, which is essentially the concept of raising the majority of the Chinese population to the middle class. Now, if you look at the primary criteria for pursuing Xiaokang policies, one is stability, and specifically stability on the external borders. And as the previous speakers mentioned here, stability along the Sino-DPRK border is a crucial element to that. It's not that North Korea and the flood of refugees, if that were to occur, could not be absorbed by China. It's just that the impact it would have on sub-regional development goals in the 3 Chinese provinces that border North Korea. These are 3 of the poorest provinces in China, and as the central leadership in Beijing is very concerned about closing the gap between the poor and the rich in China, developing these 3 Chinese provinces is something of a continual priority for the leadership. Now, with these type of activities, I would say this evolution from basing their 4 sentences upon the 2 primary principles and using the bedrock of the primary goal of economic development, internal economic development, as something of a motivating driver for all of this. One of the big reasons which explains why China has become so proactive and so multilateral in approach. This foundation is something that has, in the early phase, has proven to be quite effective. But as it relates to what China is doing now with the 6-party talks, the 6-party talks is really what you make it to be. You define it accordingly. There are those who view the 6-party talks as a success, and their definition of success is crisis management. And if you look at the capabilities that the 6-party talks brings at key moments, some see the nascent beginnings of these crisis management capabilities on a quasi-organizational basis in Northeast Asia, something that doesn't exist right now or didn't exist before the advent of the 6-party talks. However, if you view and define the 6-party talks as a denuclearization mechanism, most of the reports are very negative, and some would argue that it has been a failure up till now. As Afghanistan is sometimes referred to as the graveyard of empires, some are beginning to think of North Korea as a graveyard of engagement policies. So there's a great deal of pessimism. And as this new administration seeks to put together its North Korea policy, something that really is questionable if it even is taking place right now, but once the administration is in the place of doing their North Korea policy review and coming up with their North Korea policy, investigating the limits of Chinese activities in this respect will be crucial, because in many respects, China is the bedrock for something like the 6-party talks. Let me move now to this idea of the myth of China's leverage over North Korea. And as I mentioned before here, the caveat is that it's undisputed that China has the diplomatic and the military capabilities that dwarf North Korea. But China is constrained for 3 reasons, and this is largely why Pyongyang is essentially able to do what it does, and China has to suffer the consequences. The first is this dominant fear of not specifically DPRK refugees, but what type of impact North Korean refugees would have on the region. The instability angle is something that is of a paramount concern to China. And China frames the DPRK refugee issue in terms of law and order. So when you look at potential instability in North Korea and the event that there are refugees in North Korea, Chinese concern is that you would have poor KPA soldiers with their weapons more or less engaging in banditry on the Chinese side. This is a concern that has led to the beefing up of the security along predominantly the western side, where you have a lot of the PLA garrisoned, and on the eastern side, more of a delegation of border security to local authorities, but nonetheless a beefing up of the overall border that has begun in the early part of 2003. The second factor is, as I mentioned before, the Chinese focus on internal economic development priorities. One way to think of China in terms of domestic as well as foreign policy decision-making, a key question that the leadership appears to ask over and over again is, how does this particular domestic or foreign policy issue impact China's goal of moving forward on the economic development path? There are specific targets, and related to economic development goals are social stability considerations, many things that would not seem to preoccupy us, but as research interviews with various analysts in Beijing indicate, something that is front and center on the minds of the leadership in Beijing. The third factor is one that relates to China's prestige. With chairmanship of the 6-party talks has come a concomitant rise in China's prestige on the international stage. It reinforces the peaceful development thesis, and in many foreign policy statements, not directly related to North Korea, but China's role in the world, the 6-party talks and China's chairmanship of the 6-party talks is front and center in a lot of those messages. These 3 factors are all things that North Korea is very well aware of. And when it comes to North Korea's calibrated brinkmanship on China, It's interesting how North Korea would elevate any of these factors to a point that it makes it very difficult for China to apply any pressure on North Korea to the point where it would cause internal stress. Right now, with a lot of concern that Kim Jong-il is ailing, he is not as ill as many had been worried in the fall, but he is believed to be in the process of affecting some kind of leadership transition in North Korea. China is very hesitant to apply any pressure that may tip the scales. So in that respect, China is walking on eggshells. But also, if you take a step back, this is the celebration of the 60th anniversary of founding of diplomatic relations between North Korea and China. To put that into context, and I think, again, revisiting that point that China is constrained not only in its bilateral relationship, but also what it's trying to do with the six-party talks. Just a short while ago, North Korean Premier Kim Jong-il was in Beijing, state visit, and his meetings with Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were very much along the lines of economic cooperation, how to boost economic cooperation between the two countries in the year of the friendship, and also references to 2012 and North Korea's objective to open their economy and their country to a thriving, strong nation. And those are the very words that the Chinese leadership uses in announcing certain economic development plans between the two countries. We have that type of activity happening on the bilateral basis, and now China front and center in the Security Council, really now becoming the focus of a lot of the attention as countries feel frustration and the limits of dealing with North Korea. There's this very strong notion that if we can't pressure North Korea, then if we apply pressure on China to apply, in turn, pressure on North Korea, that may be an effective way to deal with not only the missile issue, but with the broader denuclearization activities. These type of views and these type of, I would say, diplomatic strategies of other countries, I think immediately hit a wall, because you see Chinese aversion to anything along the lines of, as an example, joining arms with the United States and applying and implementing financial sanctions on North Korea. Financial sanctions being measures going after the bank accounts of North Korean leaders and hurting the North Korean leadership in a way that it doesn't impact the people. One of the criticisms against economic sanctions being that it's a blunt instrument that ends up hurting the people more than the leadership. But you can see the contrast here, where China is averse to applying these financial sanctions, because at the same time they're cultivating these Korea Worker Party to Chinese Communist Party relationships. So I raise and emphasize that point again, that China doesn't have the freedom of motion that many people think that it does have. And this is where we get to the dramatic title of the talk, how the weak do what they can and the strong suffer what they must. This is a current situation where China is not necessarily protecting North Korea in the six-party talks, nor in the Security Council at the particular time, but really protecting the six-party talks. I think if you look at Chinese actions and statements as it tries to convince other countries not to go the route of economic sanctions and harsh censure of the North Korean missile test, China, what they're really doing is protecting the six-party talks. My last slide here, this is a picture of Park Bong-ju, who was the former premier, the unlucky gentleman who was in charge of economic reforms in North Korea. He didn't last too long, but this was a state visit to Beijing, and I think a picture says 1,000 words. China's not pushing Park Bong-ju here. It's this idea of trying to show him a path, a suggestion. The idea that economic reform, opening up, Chinese cooperation, and all of those areas would lead to peaceful coexistence for China, integration into the international community, all of those things that China thinks would be effective. The bottom line is only if North Korea were to make the decisions that we made during the Deng Xiaoping period. But I would say that this, in some respects, may be a fundamental misreading of North Korea. If you follow this logic, then economic priorities would be much more important for the North Koreans, and those economic priorities would be much more important than political priorities, and political priorities would be much more important than security priorities. I would argue that for North Korea, it's a complete inverse. And it's not that they don't want to do economic reform, but until they feel comfortable with the security environment, any type of economic inducement will not be effective. And in fact, if we look at South Korea's current policy towards North Korea, Vision 3000, denuclearization, and basically assistance with economic development, that is the bedrock of the GMP policy towards North Korea. This idea that if North Korea makes a decision to give up their nuclear weapons, in 10 years' time, the South Korean government will help North Korea raise its GDP per capita to $3,000. But you see the sequence is one that predicates the importance of economic benefits as opposed to security. Let me quickly wrap up here. For the first point, I would argue that North Korea has become very adept at manipulating and maximizing opportunities presented because of China's constrained diplomacy right now. China is trying to deal with many relationships and trying to keep many people happy at the same time, and something has to give. The second point is that Beijing exerts a great deal of patience and effort, and that's something that they are counseling other countries to display at this particular point in time as it relates to the response to the missile test. But again, this type of activity is not a coddling or a protection of North Korea per se, but more of China demonstrating what I think Bob Zellick would find quite fascinating, is a stakeholder type of responsibility that it feels vis-a-vis the six-party talks. And the final point, I would argue that as Beijing is increasingly frustrated in dealing with North Korea, that frustration has not spilled over in terms of cultivating these what they see as long-term investments in the CCP, Korea Workers' Party relationships. And if we are to try to entertain this idea that applying pressure on China to get China to apply pressure on North Korea is something that is feasible, and especially something like a North Korea policy review here in Washington, I think the last point has to be kept in mind very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jin, we would welcome your comments on patience so far.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Roy. I think our three presenters did a great job, and I don't really have much to add to their points and historically, but instead of making some comments, I will give my little observation, my general impression of the China-North Korea relations. Actually, I have 4 points. First, I want to say that China-Korean relations, and before the establishment of 2 countries, and North Korea in 1948 and China in 1949. The traditional relations between China and North Korea was at that time was also a difficult topic for Chinese government. I mean, Qing dynasty, and after the Qing dynasty for Kuomintang government is also a very, very difficult political as well as security problems. Why? It's because China didn't succeed in developing a comprehensive and a military strategy to deal with the issue related to Korean Peninsula. But I think that traditional relations, as someone summarized, is from a Korean perspective, it can be summarized as serving the great. But from China's point of view, that kind of service is completely different from the service relations between the big one and the small one in Europe and in modern international standard. So I think that's different. But why it's difficult for China is because on one hand, China itself faced the modernization drive, and at the same time, it has to deal with the political and security issue like occurring in North Korea, in Korean Peninsula. So I think that kind of situation continues even in today's circumstances. But I want to say one thing. seems to me very important in summarize the traditional relations between China and the Korean Peninsula was for China, its most important thing in its relations with Korean Peninsula was much more richer or ceremony than the political, substantial political and security meanings. And the second point I want to make is concerning the China-Korean Peninsula relations after the 1950s. I mean, after the establishment of PRC and North Korea government. The most decisive, determining factor between these two relations was not a security one, rather the political one, or to be exactly precise, that was ideology. So China trying to use its license learned from its relations with Soviet Russia to justify its relations with North Korea. But I think although for many it's not quite successful, but I think compared to North Korea, strategic thinking towards China, but they have a similarity between North Korea and China in terms of dealing with their bilateral relations. Because China, as relations with former Soviet Union, was faced similar kind of political and ideological problems. So when they're dealing with North Korea, they always pay attention to what they believe that's the problem between China and former Soviet Union. The third point I think is after the Cold War, especially when China started opening up its reform policy, the two relations became more complicated for both sides. I think they have to dealing with the domestic political problems as well as their foreign strategies. So I think it's still in the process for both China and North Korea trying to do some adjustment on their bilateral relations. For China, China tries its best to maintain the good relations with North Korea in traditional way, but at the same time, it is trying to get more understanding from the Western countries, especially the United States and other countries. So that was why China started to host the six-party talks and trying to act as some kind of mediator between North Korea and the international community. The first point I want to make is because many our representatives mentioned is China's influence on North Korea. I must say that China has some kind of influence on North Korea compared to probably Japan, South Korea, Russia, or even other countries. But China's influence is not bigger than the United States, I should say, in many senses. Because why is North Korea believe that its domestic problems as well as foreign problems can only be resolved with normalization with the United States rather than China. So I think because of that, China's role on the North Korea-related issues are quite limited because China cannot provide what North Korea need in terms of domestic politics and security. But at the same time, I think China's role is important, especially when the international community, even the United States, need someone who can understand the North Korea's logic better than others. So I think China still have a kind of role to play, although it is not be done satisfactorily from the U.S. point of view. But I think China has to maintain its current position or do something more, trying to resolve the difference between North Korea and the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. Well, I think we've had some very interesting material presented us today, and now we have an opportunity to open the floor for questions and discussion. Yes, Admiral.
Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I recall, I'm dredging up 12 years ago, at either Li Peng, or at least an official spokesman, said of the alliance, it has no military component, and some other quite nasty things. I wonder, has anything happened to, let me call it, officially restore that relationship, or does it still sort of stand that way, or are we all to assume that we should forget those words? In other words, is there that component now?
Would any of our panelists like to address that question? The issue is there now a military component to the
alliance?
To the residual alliance relationship between China and North Korea?
Sure, okay. By default. I would say, as the military component of the alliance has waned, the economic and commercial side has increased. So rather than PLA, specifically officers for the security aspect of the military for the alliance, definitely there's a military-to-military commercial aspect. A lot of the trading companies in North Korea are owned and operated by the military, by the KPA, and many of their interlocutors on the Chinese side are local Chinese, either ethnic Chinese Koreans on the border region or Chinese businessmen from other areas like Qingdao, a regional trading hub. But a lot of the early interlocutors were PLA trading companies. So I don't want to oversimplify, but I would say that at least in terms of trend lines, the PLA-KPA military interaction has declined as the KPA-PLA commercial interaction has risen.
Yes?
Thanks, Rick Smith from the Woodrow Wilson Centre here. I think the speakers have made a credible case for the limits on China's influence or leverage over the DPRK. What I'd like to ask about is the limits of China's information about what's happening in North Korea. How complete do you think is China's understanding, information, intelligence about the DPRK, both in regard to technological development, the preparation for rocket launches, etc., the nuclear program, and of course prospective changes in the leadership and so on?
Dr. Jin, would you like to comment on that?
Oh, wow, it's a difficult question for me, but I should say, and China may receive less information because of two reasons. One is China, in my personal understanding, is did a little a job in gathering information, especially from our traditional ally or the country like North Korea. So we have no intelligence activities within or outside of North Korea. So in that regard, I think the United States has more. So in many cases, China's information is from the United States. rather from North Korea, but we received many information from North Korea, but that the many of them may quite late than the other countries. So that was probably the case.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that question? Okay.
Just quickly, if I could just quickly add, the early part of research on the six-party talks, I went to Beijing for the first time in the fall of 2003, soon after the six-party talks were started, to just try to research and meet with some of the Chinese government analysts who had been looking at the six-party talks and North Korea policy. And I went with something of a hypothesis that the Chinese knew something that other people didn't. And in the course of receiving some public documents that they had written for Chinese media and so forth, you realize that the footnotes are all South Korean raw statistics. So Bank of Korea in terms of North Korean economic statistics. And if you meet some of the Bank of Korea economists, some are very good, others are just guessing growth rates and things like that. So the fact that you identify a cycle where you have the raw information gathered by South Korean sources, they're cited and used by Chinese analysts, then the outside world views the Chinese information as gold, and then they cite it accordingly. But if you trace it back, a model and analysis is only as good as the raw information, and the raw information, the quality varies quite a lot.
Did you take the Chinese at face value when they not to know the full extent of North Korea's nuclear development?
As a part of follow-up research trips, I went to the border region, and there you meet some local academics. Many of them had been educated in North Korean universities because they were the products of the Cultural Revolution. No universities in China. Kim Il-sung University was the best school around at that particular point in time. And you realize that Beijing has a 50,000 feet altitude view of North Korea. And in the border region, they have a microscopic view. And there's very little in between. But in terms of their information, the border people didn't know anything about the nuclear program. And the people in Beijing didn't know anything about the growing commercial activity. So there's a fundamental gap in terms of analysis information in China.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
John, I was intrigued by your comment on that economic inducements with North Korea won't work until the security situation is resolved. And I guess I'd kind of maybe like to try to flip this, because we tend to view security in terms of military situations, how many tanks, how many troops, things of that nature. But ultimately, all of this is underpinned by economics. A wealthy country is infinitely more secure than a poor country. I think if you ask somebody in China, perhaps before they started making economic reforms and now, they'd probably say that they feel infinitely more secure than then. So I guess, has anyone ever tried, or why is North Korea not taking the view that by building itself up economically, it could actually be more secure?
A huge caveat for me is with the North Korea field, there's a huge ongoing debate between coincidence and correlation. When certain events happen in North Korea, are they linked, or did they just happen at the same time? And with respect to the economic inducement part, I think if you go back to facts, a lot of NGOs note that North Korea can be thought of as one part as essentially a failed state that has to receive food aid and public health clinics and so forth by the international NGO community. And then you have a viable state component that looks like a viable state component in the North Korean provinces bordering the Chinese border. And if you look into those the North Korean borders with China, you have something of the center and periphery, Pyongyang and the periphery. So there's a lot going on inside North Korea. I think it's too early to make any conclusions, but you can note these transformations happening. What impact is it having on the regime? Big question mark. And I think that tails into economic inducements working. If you want to make them work, as an example, Ukraine, and the caveat there is apples and oranges, it's not the same country, but at least in the case of Ukraine as a contiguous country, one leadership, things were done in a uniform fashion. I think North Korea is at the stage right now, it's not to make excuses for them. If you get into a deal with them, how North Korea will implement that deal, if you think of North Korea as a business partner, how reliable is North Korea as a business partner? I wouldn't invest in North Korea.
Yes?
Libo, Voice of America. If you think that China's influence is so limited, and since China has the chairmanship of the six-party talks, doesn't make sense for the United States to seek other channel rather than continue to go with the six-party talks? Thanks.
Anybody want to address that question?
Well, first, I think six-party talks so far has not produced a satisfactory result in terms of denuclearization. But I think in terms of building trust, or at least getting more information from North Korea, we can see it's succeeded in some extent. But also in the future, even we cannot say that the six-party talks will succeed in getting North Korea the denuclearization successfully, but probably we can use that mechanism to discuss more broadly the security issue in Northeast Asian region. So I don't think it's urgent. There is an urgent need for us to consider another channel because this is not ready.
I think implicit in your question also is, if the six-party talks are not as effective as we would like them to be, is there some other approach that would be more effective? And my answer would be that if there was another approach that would be more effective, we would long since have shifted to it. That the reality is there isn't a more effective approach, and this one has at least enabled us to engage on the question. But I think everybody's frustrated that it hasn't been more successful in producing the forward movement that we wanted. Yes?
My name is Jeff Barron, and I have a question for Professor Schaefer. You said that between 1966 and 69, the Chinese made things very difficult for Kim Il-sung. He almost didn't survive. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, please.
Well, I don't want to use up too much time for that, but I've done a working paper a couple of years ago. You might even find it outside, where I go into some more details exactly on this question. So I don't want to go into too many details here. But apparently at that time, China was interfering in the internal affairs of many countries around the world, in particular into socialist countries, where it wanted to change leaderships to have pro-Maoist leaderships in place of the rather pro-Soviet or neutral leaderships, and there are many countries. And North Korea was, of course, a major target because it has been that close ally before. It was expected to be one of the leading vanguard countries to have a cultural revolution like China did, and they didn't, so the disappointment was pretty grave. China was just not showing any gratitude because we Chinese saved them in 1951, and so yeah. But you will find something in this working paper. I just want to refer to one of those points we had before. The few things you can get from the history of the relationship between North Korea and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is that the North Korean domestic intelligence system is extremely detailed, harsh, and very efficient and effective in many, many ways. And so, of course, it's a very small country compared to the 1.3 billion in China. But if you just see what kind of problems it causes for the Chinese leadership if there is a local, regional unrest over economic issues, and how this gets a major issue for the leadership in Beijing from time to time. And we haven't heard any similar information coming out of North Korea, where the economic situation is so much more grave where people really have to suffer famine and deprivation, and you still don't have any reports yet about any local demonstrations, unrest, and whatever. I think this really tells you a story. I think why North Korea feels quite confident in not having this urgent need for economic development as the Chinese leadership sees it. I mean, China definitely sees the economic development as a major key for having the Communist Party with the collective leadership in power for the time being, economic success. I don't think the same urgency is shared by the North Korean leadership. As long as you have economic success for the elites and for this maybe 10-15% of the people you need in order to get the system running and have the military and the intelligence in firm place, but besides those, you have quite apathetic 85% of the population who don't go to the streets or voice their concerns in any significant way which the regime considers as a threat.
Yes?
I wonder if any of the panelists would be willing to speculate on what the impact of this recent successful, or maybe not so successful, missile test would be on the North Korean attitude in the six-party talks. My impression is that after the nuclear blast, actually, somewhat counterintuitively, they became somewhat more willing to reach some agreements, and there was some progress until they ran into the verification problem. Anyway, would anyone like to speculate on what the impact might be of this recent missile test?
Sure. I would just start that I don't mean to, basically say that the six-party talks is a failure. I want to step away from any type of interpretation along those lines. But if we do, an evaluation of the performance of the six-party talks, the stated objectives, and it's accomplished, it goes back to that part of how do you define success. And I think it relates also to the missile test. Right now, the press reports are that it was a failure, that it failed to launch the satellite. But in North Korea right now, it's being heralded as a huge triumph, almost like their Sputnik. And this is happening before the 9th of April and the meeting of the 12th Supreme People's Assembly. And there they're going to proclaim Kim Jong-il as the chairman again of the National Defense Commission. So as it ties into domestic drivers in North Korea, the missile tests seem to have been very important and very successful as it relates to how now that's going to translate into North Korea's interaction in the six-party talks. There's a formula, Kangsong-taeguk, a strong and prosperous country. And it seems that as they work on the strong component of that equation, there's a certain confidence about them. I wouldn't say arrogance. Some have characterized it as arrogance, but I would say confidence. And if that enables them to feel more confident to do more deal-making, then perhaps we'll see a shift in the six-party talks and it'll be more deal-making. But it's still early days, and how things turn out inside North Korea in terms of the international response will be key. And that goes back to China's role as the stakeholder of the six-party talks. If there's a view that North Korea got away with it because China coddled them, it's going to complicate things tremendously to try to get past that perception.
Jim, did you have a question?
A couple of points on key moments in Sino-North Korean affairs. One, I think there was a critical precursor to the normalization that was mentioned from 1992, was the decision by China with respect to the United Nations to stop opposing the admission of South Korea and conversely both sides into the UN. I guess that was 1990 or 91, and that really wrote the handwriting that the normalization was going to be before long. Second is at a key moment in 2002 of North Korea's attempt for economic reforms, the plans for the Shinwiju Special Economic Zone were shredded by China in a pretty obvious way, and I'd suggest that maybe that's worth of some study too. I guess I would ask the panel in more recent times the notion, which I find quite convincing, of the 50,000 feet observation from Beijing and the on-the-ground observation along the Tumen and the Yellow Rivers. Whether North Korea is it true that North Korea has recently tried to cut down on the influence of Chinese businessmen in cross-border economic activity, and if so, what that might suggest for the future? And I guess my last comment on Dr. Jin's point on the matter of the U.S. Status in Pyongyang being as good as China's, I think that reflects a wish because of the enormously improved leverage it might give in the minds of the North Koreans. I don't think that's the reality.
Don, would you like to address that question about the...
Sure. There's a long list of Chinese companies that have failed in North Korea. And it's amazing because just as a lot of foreign investors saw China as the market where you would become a millionaire, there's actually an endless stream of Chinese businessmen who believe that they'll make their wealth in China, in North Korea of all places, from department store owners in Pyongyang to cheap consumer goods peddlers along the border region. So the long list of failed Chinese companies, they happen in certain waves as well. And certainly right now is a difficult time for Chinese smaller level merchants below the SOE level in North Korea because of this kind of duality in North Korea, the failed state component and the viable part, but the viable part not thriving, just kind of getting along, and a lot of markets sprouting up and things like that, but not really in a sustainable manner. It's definitely there, but it wanes a lot. But that said, it seems though that Chinese commercial presence in the border region is actually getting deeper, and that's igniting a lot of concern in South Korea. There's only one thing that unifies the progressives and conservatives in South Korea, and that's protecting North Korea from the Chinese. There's a view that the Chinese are, through their SOEs, carving up North Korea to be the fourth Chinese province. And there's also now a realization that reunification plans in South Korea are no longer a binary decision. It's not about the two Koreas. You suddenly have pretty large road bumps that are Chinese in the equation. I would just quickly add to that, though, the other question about information in North Korea. This is more of a hypothesis, but because of this growing Chinese commercial activity in the border region there, when it comes to contingency planning, and I'm pretty sure the Chinese are doing something along those lines, their contingency plan, I think, will be better than other countries because they have more on-the-ground people who can note this or that. The other countries don't have that, so I think that's a critical differentiator.
Yes?
Sorry. I don't know a lot about North Korea, but my question is a little bit towards a transition from Kim Jong-il. And I'm just wondering if anybody on the panel has any thoughts about this, and what country is best prepared to know more about the new leadership that could come in, because it sounds to me as if China is in a better position as regards to South Korea or to the United States. But I'm just wondering if anybody could have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
I don't think anyone is really in a better position to understand what's happening with the succession. You're hearing a lot about the sons, and I think we need to keep in mind that there is a rigid class system in North Korea, this Songbun system, where the two sons that are mentioned most often. Under the system would never qualify as successors because they come, one son comes from, one son is illegitimate, another son comes from a mother who was born in Japan. So their class would be unacceptable to the party elite. Quite honestly, though, I don't think any country that it really knows what's happening with succession.
Okay. Yes, Eric?
I guess that this happened after the 2006 Chinese expressions of anger at the missile and nuclear test. But I recall that several colleagues from China mentioned that China was making contingency plans to move large numbers of forces into North Korea if there was collapse, and particularly if there were uncertainty about the security of the nuclear weapons and the fissile material. I thought it was kind of strange that these comments were made, obviously that would be then stated in public, and what effect it would have on the relationship and so forth. I wonder if anybody in the panel will comment on that.
I would just quickly add from the 2006 period, as it relates to something like the 2003 period where the Chinese were doing the border security improvements. This is my only information is from the media reports at that time coming out of China, but they were saying that this was a part of border security standardization. So not only the border with North Korea, but the border with Myanmar were being upgraded from border police to PLA troops. And then in 2006, when there was concern of a spillover effect, there was again, reports of these type of PLA movements along the border. And during this past fall, there are also reports of PLA troop movements, as even the Chinese were in the dark as what was happening with Kim Jong-il's health. But I go back to that whole coincidence correlation. We commissioned a report, and it'll be coming out probably in a couple of weeks, where we got 2 researchers to go to the border region and to research the border capabilities. And it turns out that PLA troops stationed there, as well as border police, they engage in a lot of economic development activity, and it's a part of their mandate. Very similar to what Byrne put in terms of the picture of volunteers in post-Reconstruction Korean War North Korea. You have these PLA troops thatching roofs in certain provinces along the border on the Chinese side, and it's a part of local governors and local provincial authorities' report card by the central leadership. How are they doing on increasing social equality in their jurisdictions and so forth? So the fact that you have an increase in some of these troops, what proportion, that's unclear, but these type of economic development and equalization and social development type of programs are pretty widespread in that area.
John, let me add that I specifically tried to pin it down and say, are you talking about reinforcements on the border? And the direct answer was no. I'm talking about moving divisions into North Korea specifically to handle the situation that I just described to you. That's a very different answer from what I got just a few years before, and I thought it was strange to be stated quite so blatantly.
Well, in the sense that the border is different, the Tandong area is where you're talking about the PLA divisions being garrisoned, and there you actually have build-out of bases. That's something of a regional headquarters. But the farther you go on the east, it's a very porous border. That's where the 2 American journalists were abducted. It's so porous that you don't know what's what in terms of territory. But one of the reasons, apparently, is that it facilitates this market coping mechanism where North Koreans go onto the Chinese side, buy cheap Chinese consumer goods, bring them back for these various markets in North Korea. But the border, it's a tale of 2 stories. On the western side, it's very much what you described, divisions, garrisons, the deployments, and so forth. And on the eastern side, it's almost like a Wild West type of market frontier. It's almost like a frontier region.
Yes?
Actually, my first question was additional to a previous question to Dr. Schaefer about the historical review of North Korea-China relations. well, I wanted to ask if you found any pattern of the bilateral relation. Well, if you know any pattern change or the future pattern type, well, that you can talk about the changing, ongoing as a historian. And my second question is general, about the efficacy of sending someone to North Korea as a breakthrough, as the U.S. did send Henry Kissinger to China. Well, at the stalemate situation, the U.S. tries to solve the problem anyway, and I wonder what the Obama administration will be happier with a kind of suggestion of sending someone. Well, if it happens, I wonder about the leftist relations between China and North Korea. Thank you.
Anyone want to take that on?
And did you want to talk about patterns first?
I'll just talk about the first part of your question, and then somebody else can continue on that. Well, I think the history of the Sino-North Korean relations is that it actually did not start out as a pattern, and it really took a learning curve for both sides, and they had quite some unsettling experiences with each other. But after a while, I think at least from the 70s, the pattern evolved, which I would define as stability. You are interested in stability in both regimes, and basically as less interference as possible. You do not want to interfere and to meddle too much into the internal affairs of the internal regime of the other side, because this becomes unsettling to both sides. So you basically try to manage the status quo and keep close relations, but in a certain distance, but you basically manage the status quo in order to have stability between both sides. What about what the Obama administration is going to do? I mean, of course, one of the main problems, other people, of course, will continue on that. One of the main problems, of course, it hasn't been mentioned, but it is obvious, is, of course, U.S.-South Korean relations. South Korea is a close American ally, and it has quite a history on that. And what North Korea always wanted, we have it during the 60s to the 70s, and later on we have it now. North Korea would like to have one-on-one negotiations with the U.S. with the exclusion of South Korea, and negotiate something to its benefit with regard to security guarantee and normalization, and having a full peace agreement for the 53 war, which of course ended in armistice, and having South Korea out of the picture as much as possible. And if the U.S. would follow these North Korean intentions and really going too much on one-to-one, I think this would lead to quite some problems in the ROK-U.S. relationship, and this is something which currently the administration certainly considers in all kinds of respects. And at some point they might come out with a public strategy. We'll see whether that's going to happen.
Now this is actually an interesting pattern that did start, and it started, I think, in '68 with the Pueblo crisis. This idea that North Korea quickly realized that if it did engage in calculated adventurism, the U.S. was not going to retaliate or respond militarily, but would actually sit down and negotiate with it one-on-one. Going back to that crisis, even North Korea tried to exclude South Korea, which had just suffered from as you may remember, the attack on the Blue House 2 days before the Pueblo was seized. South Korea was very concerned that its concerns were not going to be represented in the MAC meetings. There were some the Military Armistice Commission meetings between the U.S. and North Korea to resolve the Pueblo crisis, I think from February through December of '68. But from that incident, North Korea began to realize that you just engage in calculated adventurism, you get the United States to the negotiating table, and you can exclude South Korea. This, as Bernd pointed out, I think is what North Korea would want. Again, I think the missile test just the other day fits into this pattern. Engage in calculated adventurism, you get the United States to sit down and negotiate with you one-on-one. Clearly, this is what North Korea wants. It prefers this to the six-party talks.
We've run out of time. I would like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I think that the presentations by the panelists and the subsequent discussion has shown very clearly that the relationship between China and North Korea is a very important one, but it's one that is fraught with extreme sensitivities, and that North Korea has not found an ideal way of dealing with China, and China has not found an ideal way of dealing with North Korea. So thank you all very much.